The devastating effects of World War I had a profound impact on how people thought about the world, about progress and society. Improvements in science and industrial manufacturing may have led to some positive developments in life, but to many people, they seemed primarily to have resulted disastrously in arms production on an unprecedented scale and mass slaughter in the trenches of Northern Europe. Art between the world wars, which is often referred to as interwar art, played a pivotal role in shaping the modernist environment. It spanned from the aftermath of World War I to the onset of World War II, and this period was marked by significant upheaval, uncertainty, and profound social change. Artists who adopted the term Dada for their art protested against the kinds of so-called rational thought processes that had led to the war. Dadaism also took the Impressionists and the Cubists' questioning of representation still further and radically rejected existing traditions, if not the notion of art altogether. In the folklore of the Dada art movement, the name was notoriously chosen at random by shooting a dart at a dictionary. Dada is both a nonsense word and one that has contradictory meanings in several different languages. The upheaval of war led the Dadaists to reject prevailing cultural norms, expressing a resounding no to conventional art, to societal norms, to politics, and to decorum. However, they also embraced a resounding yes to creativity, life, and spontaneity, often employing provocative and absurd tactics to challenge social conventions. Marcel Duchamp emerged as a key figure in the Dada movement, first in Europe and then later in New York. He's known for his radical concepts and for audacious challenges to the traditional notions of art. He had the audacity to offer mass-produced objects as artworks, and he called them ready-mades. We've already come across one in one of our earlier modules. If you remember the fountain, which was a urinal that had been signed, turned on its edge, and then put on display. The ready-made involves taking mundane, often utilitarian objects, not generally considered to be art, and transforming them by adding to them, by changing them, or as in the case of the most famous work by Marcel Duchamp, The Fountain, by simply renaming and reorienting them and placing them in an appropriate setting. In LHOOQ, the found object is a cheap postcard reproduction of Leonardo da Vinci's early 16th century painting, the Mona Lisa, onto which Duchamp drew a mustache and a beard in pencil. He signed the work with his own name and then he titled it. And if you are able to speak French and you can read these letters aloud in French, read them really quickly out loud, then you'll understand that this is a roughly vulgar term that translates in English loosely to she's hot in the tail. For Duchamp, what mattered were the choices of the artist and the way art affected our minds. The making of the work and its appearance were secondary. By showing irreverence toward a deeply treasured painting, Duchamp tried to shake people out of their unthinking acceptance of dominant values. Duchamp was responsible for three major innovations in art in the 20th century, ready-mades, which we're discussing here, but also kinetic sculpture, that is sculpture with moving parts, and then what would come to be known as conceptual art, which we'll discuss a little bit further in the module. Dadaism embodied a spirit of rebellion rather than a unified movement. Dada artists used the ready-made and photo montage as forms for social critique and for activism. The work that came out of the movement included performance art, it included publications, and all of these were critical and somewhat playful at the same time. They emphasized individuality, irrationality, chance, and the use of and imagination. Among the leading figures of Dada in the United States was the American artist Man Ray, who was a close friend of Marcel Duchamp. Man Ray's Dada works encompass paintings, photographs, and assembled objects. In 1921, he bought a clothing iron and a box of tacks and a tube of glue from a houseware shop. After gluing a row of tacks to the smooth surface of the iron, he titled his assemblage Gift, thus creating both a useless and a dangerous object. A member of the Berlin Dada, Hannah Hoch, was one of the first Dadaists to expand on Cubist principles with photomontage, merging parts of photographs in thought-provoking compositions. Berlin emerged as a significant hub for Dada art among the chaos following Germany's surrender. Reflecting the disorder of the times, artists gathered, adhering to the belief that art should mirror the tumultuous reality, no matter how chaotic. During the Weimar Republic, artists like Hannah Hoch pioneered collages utilizing imagery from both magazines and mass media to challenge cultural norms. In The Multimillionaire, the industrial age figure looms large against the products of his creation. The disorder of the image reflects the chaos of the time, symbolizing the fractured nature of society. She is purposefully subverting conventional pictorial space by making a flat image with no perspective and leaving the viewer to unpack the meaning. Dada permanently altered the artistic landscape, introducing experimental approaches that continue to shape contemporary art. Marcel Duchamp's concept of the ready-made stands as one of Dada's most enduring legacies. Surrealism, like its predecessor, was not merely an artistic style, but a philosophical approach to life, and similar to Dada, was opposed to rationality and convention. Surrealists believed that art was a model for human freedom, meaning, and creativity in an absurd world. The movement began in the early 1920s among a group of writers and poets, and as it developed in the interwar period, it was taken up by visual artists. Surrealism experimented with a new mode of expression known as automatic writing or automatism, and it was aimed at unleashing the untamed imagination within the subconscious. It was the first artistic style based on the ideas of Austrian psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud. In order to make artwork that was not fully under their conscious control, the artists used techniques that Freud had developed to access his patients' unconscious minds. Dreams and dreamlike images were very important in their work. One of the early proponents of surrealism was the German artist Max Ernst. He was a former Dadaist and he was deeply affected by his experiences in World War I. Ernst experimented with techniques like collage, rubbings, scrapings, and assemblage to encourage chance occurrences that would reduce his conscious control of the work. In this way, he could be surprised by the patterns that emerged, and then they would fertilize the imagery in his paintings. Ernst's surrealist paintings are steeped in Freudian metaphor, in his own private mythology, and in his childhood memories. One of the major themes centered on the image of the bird, which often incorporated humanistic elements. And although some of these birds look benign or innocent enough, their mere presence often appears to be ominous. He first coupled birds and windblown apocalyptic animals in a series of small works entitled The Horde from 1927. And he returned to the theme again in 1935 in a series of even smaller works called The Barbarians. And we're looking at an example of this in the upper right portion of your screen. In this painting, a gigantic, malevolent-looking bird couple marches forward with seemingly mile-long strides. The dark female leads the way as her male companion turns to look at the strange animal, perhaps their offspring, clinging to his left arm. In the far distance, a tiny woman holds on to some undefinable winged being. The strange patterns on the bodies of the main figures, which look like fossils or geological formations, are the result of a technique called grattage or scraping. In this technique, the artist would coat the canvas, or in this case, a piece of cardboard, with layers of paint, and while it was still wet, he would press into it objects that left their imprints in the surface. Afterward, he would use a brush to touch up the forms that were created this way, or he would also scrape away some layers of the pigment. The Belgian painter René Magritte emerged as one of the most prominent figures, renowned for his distinctive style characterized by illogical realism, mind-bending mystery, and playful wit. One of his most iconic works, The Treachery of Images, challenges conventional preconceptions of reality and representation. Through this paradoxical portrayal, Magritte invites viewers to question the relationship between images and their underlying realities. He urges us to consider the deceptive nature of representation. In The Lovers, Magritte presents seemingly ordinary scene of a couple engaged in a passionate kiss. However, upon closer examination, the composition seems to defy logic because the lovers' faces are covered by fabric, and that would make the kiss impossible, right? The painting challenges viewer to attempt to reconcile this visual contradiction. And in order to do that, we have to imagine ourselves in the scene. And as soon as we do that, we get the jolt that the surrealists wanted to induce. In contrast, Juan Mirau's abstract surrealism provides suggestive elements that give a wide play to the viewer's imagination. They emphasize color and design rather than the storytelling content. To access the unconscious, Mirau and others used automatic processes in which chance was a key factor. Like Ernst, they would scribble, they would doodle, they would pour paint in order to cultivate an accident that might prove revealing in some ways. With the adoption of such spontaneous and automatic methods, the surrealists sought to expand consciousness by throwing out any sort of rational planning within the process of creation. Mirau's evocative paintings often depict imaginary creatures. He made them by scribbling or doodling on the canvas and then examining the results to see what the shapes suggested, much like finding shapes that we can recognize in clouds. The bold organic shapes in Woman Haunted by the Passage of the Bird Dragonfly Omen of Bad News are typical of his mature work. The wild, tormented quality, however, is unusual for Mirau and reflects perhaps his reaction to the times. Mirau pointed out that this painting was done at the time of the Munich crisis, in which Hitler was allowed to take over part of Czechoslovakia, and that became a prelude to World War II. And even though there's a sense of terror here, Mirau's underlying playfulness is still apparent. He loved the art of children so much that he tried to paint like a child. In 1936, a 23-year-old Swiss artist named Merit Oppenheim bought a teacup, a saucer, and a spoon from a department store in Paris and wrapped them in the cream and tan pelt of a Chinese gazelle. Her furry little offering became a defining artifact of surrealism. André Breton, the founder of surrealism, was enchanted by it. Here was an artwork that chimed with his declaration that beauty will be convulsive or it will not be at all. He gave the work its title and included it in a first exhibition dedicated to surrealist objects. As the talking point of the show, this sculpture became the receptacle of all kinds of theories, fears, and longings. This being the age of Freud, a sexual interpretation was inescapable. The spoon was phallic, the cup was vaginal, and the hair was pubic. For some, the tongue-shaped spoon brought to mind unpleasant sensations of a furry tongue. Others experienced unease at seeing a graceful item of the tea table transformed into something decadent and animalistic. Some gagged at the thought of getting a hair or damp tea leaves in their mouth, and then still others wanted to stroke it. Oppenheim's friend and mentor, Marcel Duchamp, had achieved something similar in 1919 when he took that postcard of the Mona Lisa and he drew a black mustache and a beard on her smooth, beautiful face. But while his hairy additions had a comical effect, Oppenheim's were creepier. They were more visceral. Luncheon in Fur is a notable innovation and a distinctive contribution to surrealism, and it falls within the category or concept of the poetic object, which means there's a kind of a fusion between poetry and the object that challenges reason, that summons the subconscious and poetic associations from the viewer. Poetic objects, also known as assemblages, were usually mundane, mass-produced objects that found new resonances when arranged in unprecedented and provocative configurations. As Breton proclaimed, to aid the systematic derangement of all the senses, it is my opinion that we must not hesitate to bewilder sensation. Salvador Dali was highly influenced by Freud's dream theory and created perhaps its most renowned masterpiece of surrealism, The Persistence of Memory. It directly delved into the depths of his own nightmares. The Persistence of Memory portrays a desolate, barren landscape inhabited by a stretched out looking figure near the center that is often interpreted as a representation of the artist himself, alongside several drooping watches. The cliffs in the background resemble the Catalan coast in Spain where Dali lived. After a late night, Dali was playing with some melted cheese from dinner, and it inspired the three warped melting watch faces that we see in the painting. In this scene, time is melting away, which emphasizes its impermanence. Some scholars relate the painting to physicist Albert Einstein's theory of relativity, which addresses the complexities of time. In Dali's painting, the clocks all display a different time, conveying a distorted sense of time as well as space. Dali also painted a fly on the melting watch that is drooping over the edge, which is a visual metaphor for the phrase, time flies. The fly, along with the ants on the closed watch in the foreground, also symbolize death and decay. Dali's style is often labeled as representational surrealism, and it presents a captivating kind of contradiction in a way. His rendering of form is incredibly precise and realistic, but the objects themselves could never exist in reality. The use of extremely realistic imagery in surprising ways jolts our expectations. Dali and the artists of the Surrealist movement challenged the very idea of objective reality, that is, that universal truths exist that are independent of the human mind. They considered that idea absurd. That art could play a role in bringing about a better society was a 19th century idea, if we remember back to neoclassicism. Yet it found a new application after World War I through collective approaches. Surrealism had hoped to liberate human consciousness, and so it offered a personal solution to life during the years following World War I. But other art movements that emerged between the wars had goals of improving the world somehow, and we will look at three of these. These movements rejected representational forms in favor of non-objective art, emphasizing pure form, color, and geometry. Along with Vasily Kandinsky, artists such as Kazimir Malevich and Piet Mondrian were some of the first artists working in a completely non-objective, abstract mode. As they experimented with new ways of representing the world, these artists also imagined how form affected human experience. Suprematism is a Russian abstract art movement developed by Kazimir Malevich in 1915, and it's characterized by the use of simple geometric shapes and also associated with ideas of spiritual purity. Cubism had made possible many ambiguities between presence and absence, representation and abstraction, figure and ground. Far from presenting the world as stable and predictable, Cubism suggested constant change and evolution, and in this way, it makes visible important characteristics of modern life. Malevich had appreciated Cubism's ability to deconstruct art. His painting, Suprematist Composition, Airplane Flying, shows in its title that the artist was also familiar with futurism, as the subject is a speeding modern airplane. Malevich believed that shapes and colors in a painting always communicate, no matter what the subject of the work. Ideally, he thought art should not need subject matter. The term suprematism refers to an abstract art based on the supremacy of pure artistic feeling, rather than on visual depiction of objects. For Malevich, it is upon the foundations of non-objectivity that the future of the universe will be built, a future in which appearances, objects, comfort, and convenience no longer dominate. Ferdinand Leger's painting, The City, is a seminal work in the realm of modernist art, which blends elements of cubism, abstraction, and mechanical imagery to depict the bustling energy and the dynamism of urban life. In The City, Leger presents a vibrant and fragmented view of the modern metropolis, characterized by geometric shapes, bold colors, and intersecting planes. Buildings, bridges, and machinery are depicted in an abstracted manner, reflecting the fragmentation and the rapid pace of technological and industrial advancements during the early 20th century. One of the most striking aspects of The City is Leger's use of contrasting forms and colors to create a strong sense of movement, space, and rhythm. The composition literally pulsates with energy, as if the city itself is alive and in motion. His incorporation of cylindrical forms and mechanical elements further enhances the sense of modernity and industrialization. The use of these particular tubular forms is also an indicator of his personal style of abstraction, sometimes also referred to as tubism. Constructivism was a revolutionary movement that began in Russia. Post-World War I development that extended out of Russian futurism and rejected the idea of space as still and uniform. It also focused on developing a new visual language for a new industrial age. While both suprematism and constructivism embraced abstraction and geometric form, we can see that relationship. They differed in their philosophical underpinnings and in the way they applied those things. Suprematism focused on the transcendental and the spiritual aspect of art, aiming to evoke pure feeling through abstract forms. Constructivism emphasized the social and the practical dimensions of art, aiming to integrate art into everyday life and to contribute to the construction of a new social order. They felt that the non-representational language they were creating would provide an ideal basis for the utopian society that they sought. The constructivist name stemmed from their preference for creating flat geometric forms, infusing their art with a kind of two-dimensional energy, and also sometimes incorporating moving parts. The painter Lyubov Popova pioneered many of these effects in non-representational works that she called painterly architectonics. Planes intersect in shallow spaces that derive from cubism. Although the work seems to resemble a mechanical device of some unknowable kind of function, nothing is pictured here except forms and colors. Popova combined her painting with teaching in worker schools, and she also helped to found the first working group of constructivists in 1921. From 1917 until his death in 1944, painter Piet Mondrian was the leading spokesperson for an art reflecting universal order. And under his guidance, a group of Dutch artists formed the movement known as de stijl, meaning the style. Their objective was to create a world of universal harmony using the abstract vocabulary of art in painting, architecture, furniture, and graphic design. Mondrian's artistic evolution epitomizes the essence of the de stijl collective. While it may bear some resemblance to suprematism, Mondrian's approach sought to liberate painting entirely from the representation of real objects and personal expression or emotion. So if we think back to the reference to futurism and to airplanes in the earlier work, or to the emphasis on emotion in suprematism, we can start to understand how the idea at work here in the de stijl principles is really in contrast to that. Mondrian's work, such as Tableau 3, represents an austere style which centers on the expressive potential of reducing painting to variations of basic visual elements and their relationships. We see straight lines, we see primary colors, and we see rectangular shapes, plus the use of black and white. It's really about subtle adjustments to proportion and placement of each of these elements. Mondrian was interested in, and his work is informed by the principles, the Renaissance principles of design and composition and proportion, known as the golden section. Mondrian believed that the clarity and organization of his compositions reflected rational beauty that is objective and appeals to the mind in a universal way, as opposed to a subjective kind of beauty which might appeal to the senses. He created a new aesthetic that he hoped would provide a poetic vitality capable of setting standards of harmony for the new technological age. Founded by Walter Gropius in Germany in 1919, the Bauhaus School had a broader scope, encompassing architecture, art, and design education. The building, designed by Walter Gropius, exemplifies the principles of De Stijl and constructivism. Today, the minimalist style championed by both the De Stijl and the Bauhaus influences various aspects of daily life, including architecture, interiors, clothing, and furnishings. Functionalism was also central to the Bauhaus school philosophy, which sought to integrate all fine and applied arts. It valued them all equally. Initially, the Bauhaus school focused on handcrafted goods, but they eventually embraced industrial production, and that was really a way to ensure the school's survival. This conceptual shift, though, revolutionized design, and it laid the foundation for the international style, which became dominant in modernist architecture and education. Despite some differing ideological perspectives, both the De Stijl and the Bauhaus were concerned with the social and cultural implications of design. Both groups believed in the importance of functionality. Both aimed to create practical, useful objects and buildings that served their intended purposes efficiently. They both embraced simplicity, clarity, and rationality. They wanted to eliminate unnecessary ornamentation and decoration in favor of clean lines and harmonious proportions. Additionally, both movements saw the potential of industrialization and mass production to make well-designed objects accessible to a broader audience, experimenting with standardized components and modular designs. They aimed to create environments that fostered social progress, often with utopian ideals of improving society through design. With an international outlook, they attracted artists and designers from diverse backgrounds, believing in the universality of their design principles. Architect and designer Ludwig Mies van der Rohe was one of the most influential figures associated with the Bauhaus and the international style. And his German pavilion, designed for Barcelona's World Fair in 1929, exemplifies his pioneering approach to modern architecture. It really showcases his use of materials such as marble, glass, and steel to create a sleek and minimalist structure. Mies van der Rohe focused on creating fluid spaces within the pavilion, ensuring that visitors would experience a sense of openness and continuity rather than feeling confined within traditional enclosed spaces. The pavilion has become an architectural icon. It's celebrated for its elegant and its timeless design. Its simple yet sophisticated aesthetic continues to inspire architects and designers worldwide. One of the most notable features of the pavilion is the rectangular pool that's adjacent to the main structure. This pool not only adds to the visual appeal of the pavilion, but it also serves as a reflective surface, enhancing the overall ambiance of the space. Mies van der Rohe's German pavilion is considered a seminal work of modern architecture, reflecting the principles of the international style and the Bauhaus movement. It has had a lasting impact on architectural design, and it continues to be studied and admired by scholars, students, and practitioners alike. Unlike Frank Lloyd Wright, who integrated his houses within their natural surroundings, architects of the international style intentionally contrasted the manufactured appearances of their houses with the natural environment. The use of steel frames liberated exterior walls from bearing weight, leading to interiors that were flooded with natural light and offered flexible spaces. Asymmetrical designs in many international style buildings resulted in a harmonious interplay between open spaces, which are also known as voids, and enclosed areas or solids, all of which are free from decorative embellishments of any kind. In architecture, designers often play with the balance between voids and solids to create interesting spatial compositions and visual effects. Voids can include areas like an atrium or a courtyard or open plan interiors, while solids are the walls and the floors and any other enclosed elements that define the boundaries of a space. One of the most renowned examples of the international style is the Villa Savoy in the western suburbs of Paris. Its ground floor primarily serves as a garage space with a small entry hall, while the living areas on the upper floors feature outdoor terraces connected by ramps and spiral staircases. Designed by Le Corbusier, the Villa Savoy embodies the spirit of the international style. It showcases its structure plainly. It employs modern materials, and it really eliminates ornamentation entirely. Le Corbusier envisioned the house as a, quote, machine for living in, incorporating space for the latest domestic appliances like the trash compactor. During the interwar period, many artists turned their focus to political themes, particularly protesting against fascism and dictatorship, which were seen as antithetical to the principles of democracy, individual freedom, and social progress that was so important to artists associated with the Distille, suprematism, and constructivism. In 1937, while the Spanish Civil War was in progress, Pablo Picasso was commissioned by the doomed Spanish Democratic government to paint a mural for the Paris International Exposition. On April 26th of that year, he was shocked into action by the mass bombing of the defenseless Basque town of Guernica. To aid his bid for power, General Franco had allowed Hitler to use his bombers on the town as a demonstration of military power. The bombardment, which leveled the 15 blocks of the city center, was the first incidence of saturation bombing in the history of warfare. Hundreds died, and more were strafed with machine gun fire from German aircraft as they fled the city into neighboring fields. Appalled by this brutality against the people of his native country, Picasso responded by creating the mural-sized painting Guernica. In Guernica, Picasso combines elements of Cubism and the emotional intensity of Expressionism, as well as elements of abstract surrealism. Symbolism abounds in this painting, with images like the dying horse representing the anguish of the victims, and also a faint flower amidst the rubble that hints at hope amid despair. Notice how he will juxtapose old and new sources of illumination, like the traditional oil lamp and the modern electric bulb, for example. And it's possible that these may symbolize the struggle between darkness and enlightenment. Picasso described the painting itself as an instrument of war. And although the work stems from a specific incident, it is a statement of protest against the brutality of all war. Between the world wars, a socially and politically committed form of art called social realism became common in many countries. This style took many forms, but they all include a retreat from the radical innovations of modern art and a desire to communicate more readily with the public about social causes and issues. So here we see a move in an opposite direction happening at the same time as the move towards abstraction. Mexican social realism took the form of mural paintings that embodied the ideals of the Mexican Revolution. Inspired by the murals of the Italian Renaissance and pre-Columbian wall paintings of ancient Mexican cultures, the muralists envisioned a national art that would glorify the traditional Mexican heritage and promote the new post-revolutionary government. Diego Rivera's The Liberation of the Peon is part of a larger body of work, and Rivera often focused on themes of social justice, labor, and revolution. In this mural, Rivera portrays the struggle of the oppressed peasant class in Mexico and their eventual liberation through collective action and revolution. So we see the landlord's house burning in the background while revolutionary soldiers untie the man from the stake and cover his naked body, which is scarred by having repeated lashings. Like Picasso's Guernica, the Liberation is an icon of 20th century art. While both paintings address themes of social injustice and oppression, they do so in different contexts. The liberation of the peon focuses on the specific struggles of the Mexican peasant class, while Guernica addresses the broader issues of the human cost of war and violence. Both artworks are powerful statements about the human condition and the need for social change. During the challenging years of the 1930s, the United States government also played an active role in supporting the arts, despite the economic depression. Through programs like the Work Progress Administration, painters were commissioned to create murals in public buildings, while the Farm Security Administration employed photographers and filmmakers to document the hardships faced by those affected by the Dust Bowl and economic downturn. Under this government support, documentary photography, exemplified by the work of Dorothea Lange, reached new heights. Lange's commission from the FSA led her to focus her lens on the plight of migrant workers, capturing poignant scenes that brought attention to the realities of poverty and displacement. In late 1938, Lange photographed 3 families camping behind a billboard advertising train travel. And the image highlights the stark contrast between their circumstances and the promise of luxury depicted in the advertisement. Such images really serve to raise awareness of contemporary hardships and foster empathy for those most affected by the Depression. One of the most vibrant movements that was dedicated to societal improvement in the United States emerged in Harlem, located in the northeastern section of Manhattan Island. In the 1920s, Harlem became a hub for some of the greatest Black American talents of this era, including artists, musicians, writers, scientists, and educators. Renowned figures such as Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Langston Hughes, and Jacob Lawrence contributed to the flourishing creative energy, leading to the period being dubbed the Harlem Renaissance. There was a spirit of newfound freedom of expression through the arts, shaping the first modern Afrocentric cultural movement and forming a Black avant-garde in the visual arts. Aaron Douglas, seen here, is hailed as the father of African American art. He pioneered a modern visual language that redefined representations of Black Americans. Influenced by movements like Cubism and the graphic arts, Douglas also drew inspiration from West African art, seeing it as a connection to African heritage. Douglas developed a distinctive style that he termed geometric symbolism. It blended contemporary modern art's flattened spaces with the narrative clarity of Mexican muralists. His series, Aspects of Negro Life, painted for the New York Public Library's 135th Street branch during the early years of the Great Depression, stood as a beacon of hope amidst the fading dream of the Harlem Renaissance that began to happen under the weight of economic turmoil. Archibald Motley, whom Locke mentioned in The New Negro, took a realist view of Black American culture. His painting, Barbecue of 1934, is energetic, lively, and full of motion, and it also shows an interest in how figures look under artificial light. Motley was renowned for vividly portraying the African American experience in 1920 and 1930s Chicago. Unlike many Harlem Renaissance artists, Motley never resided in Harlem. He was born in New Orleans, but spent most of his life in Chicago. In his portraits, he aimed to educate both white and Black audiences about the politics of skin tone. He was committed to accurately representing African Americans, and this extends to his meticulous efforts in depicting each individual characteristics, showing diversity within the community. He sought to affirm Black identity for African Americans while challenging stereotypes and racism among white viewers. In the 1930s, the spread of the Depression, along with political upheaval, helped motivate artists in the United States to search for both a national and a personal identity. In this atmosphere of relative cultural isolation, an American regionalism developed based on the idea that artists in the United States could find their identity by focusing attention on subject matter that was local and American. And by American, we mean United States. Edward Hopper made several trips to Europe between 1906 and 1910, but he mostly ignored European avant-garde movements as he portrayed the loneliness of much of American urban life. Nighthawk, seen on your screen here, shows Hopper's fascination with the mood of people in a particular place and a particular time. The haunting effects of his paintings come largely from how carefully organized his compositions are, as well as his controlled use of light and shadow. He uses light and shadow to clarify and to organize the structure of a composition. Hopper is an amazing composer. Light, if we notice in this painting, is usually contrasted against dark, and this contrast is really what guides the eye through the paintings. Look at the visual pathways that spiral from the foreground through the interior of the diner and through past its few occupants, ultimately landing on the lone figure with his back to the viewer. This passage really speaks poetically to both social and cultural isolation. American regionalism stands as a distinct artistic movement that emerged alongside modernism in the early 20th century. While modernism focused on avant-garde experimentation and urban themes, American regionalism celebrated rural life and landscapes of the American heartland. The most forceful spokesperson for American regional art was Thomas Hart Benton. He was the son of a Missouri United States senator. Benton worked to create a style that was American in both form and content, a realistic style that would be easily understood by all based on the depiction of American themes. Palisades was part of a series of paintings titled American Historical Epic. Thinking back to the module on neoclassicism and conventional history painting that usually features images of great men. In contrast to those, Benton wanted to create a people's history, one that depicted the actions of ordinary people on the land. So here, the European colonizers are staking out and dividing up the land, while the indigenous people, in contrast, are sharing their knowledge of growing corn, which the newcomers will need for survival. Some of the strength in his depiction of these figures comes from the influence of Michelangelo's work and Michelangelo's depiction of muscular bodies. But Benton transformed Renaissance and modern influences into a really personal style in which all forms are conditioned around the design of curvilinear rhythms. We can see the push and the pull of these shapes in this shallow space, and it's emphasized by contrasting light and dark edges. And this shows what Benton learned from Cubism. Regional painter Grant Wood studied art in Paris in the early 1920s, and on return to America, he dedicated himself to memorializing the unique character of the land, the people, and their way of life. Wood depicted his native Midwest with the clarity and precision that he had observed in Northern Renaissance masters, such as Jan van Eyck and Dürer, and the organic lines and curves of Art Deco design, melding these disparate styles into a uniquely American vision. In painting small town and rural life, Wood gave the American public an idealized vision of itself at a time during the Great Depression when most common working Americans were facing great hardships. His restrained color, the simplification of round masses, such as the trees and the faces of the people, and the high detail that we see are typical of Wood's paintings. The two figures are the artist's sister and his dentist, and they are echoed in the pointed arches window shapes. Vertical lines and paired elements dominate this composition. So, for example, the lines of the pitchfork are repeated again in the man's overalls as well as in his shirt front. The upright tines of the fork seem to symbolize the pair's firm traditional stance and hard-won virtue. Wood's American Gothic has become a national icon that speaks to many. It continues to spark a wide variety of responses. This work has been praised and it's been derided by critics and by the public. But his paintings, and in particular American Gothic, remain some of the most iconic, most appropriated paintings created by an American artist.